Hey, welcome back, ScreenCrush. I'm Ryan Airy, and this is all of the Easter eggs, references, and little things you might have missed in X-Men 97, Episode 2. This episode adapted one of the all-time greatest X-Men comics and teased a tragic story that, believe it or not, was hinted at in the very first season of X-Men way back in 1993. Not to mention that ending with the double of Jean Grey. So I'm going to explain all that and more, but first, I am so proud to announce that we have designed these new X-Men parody shirts in our merch store. We have the X-Men Nighthawks, drawn by Spawn artist Mark Spears, the Xmas Club, parody of the Breakfast Club, and Doug as Wolverine. For 1 week only, these shirts are 15% off, and shopping our merch store is the best way for you to directly support our channel so we can bring you videos like this one. So let's dive in.
Let's get started.
Now I want to talk first about the voice cast of the show, because many of the original voice cast have returned or been shuffled around to different characters. Norm Spencer, the original Cyclops, has sadly passed away, so he has been replaced by Ray Chase. Wolverine, Storm, Jean, and Mr. Sinister are all played by the same actors. Rogue is even voiced by the original actor Lenore Zann, even though she became a member of Canadian Parliament after the original series ended.
No way, that's so cool.
Yes, it is. Professor Xavier is now voiced by the great mimic Ross Marquand. Marquand also did a spot-on imitation of Hugo Weaving's Red Skull in Infinity War and Endgame.
If only it were that easy.
Holly Chow now voices Jubilee, after the original actor said she would rather the character be played by an actual Asian American actor. Now, they also recast Cable because, according to showrunner Bo DeMaio, substituting the original actor Bane, quote, enhanced the unconventional dynamic between Cable and his father, Scott Summers / Cyclops.
Wait a minute, Cable is Cyclops' son?
Buddy, this show is about to get weird on levels that we never dreamed of, but I'll explain all that in just a bit because there's like some potential spoilers from the comics. Now, when we broke down the first episode, I mentioned that Jean was pregnant, and this is where I have to get into a little bit of comic book history. In the comics, Jean Grey full-on died at the end of the Dark Phoenix saga, and originally they had no intention of bringing her back.
It's over?
But a few years later, Scott met a woman named Madeline Pryor who looked exactly like Jean Grey. They fell in love and had a baby together, Nathan Christopher Summers. But it turns out that Madeline was actually a clone of Jean Grey that was created by Mr. Sinister. So in the comics and in the TV show, Mr. Sinister is obsessed with the DNA of Scott and Jean. His ultimate goal is to create a perfect species of mutant kind, and he believes that Scott and Jean's genes will create that perfection.
You are the prototypes, and from your offspring, I will control the future of all human creatures on Earth.
So, after Jean died, Mr. Sinister cloned her to essentially breed the clone with Scott. That duplicate Jean at the end of this episode hints that this storyline is going to be adapted in this show, but I'll explain some key differences and theories a little bit later.
Hey person, I just want to say that you're really important to me.
Thanks, man. You're really important to me, too.
So, you know, I got you a present.
Aw, Doug, this is a star map commemorating where the stars were the day that we met.
It sure is.
Thank you. High five. This star map was made by Under Lucky Stars, the sponsor of this video. Under Lucky Stars creates a personalized custom star map showing the unique alignment of the stars in a place and time chosen by you. This is a great gift to remember an important moment in your life. All you have to do is enter the time and location, and they create a print of the sky. This shows the constellations and locations of all the stars, showing how they were aligned at your special moments. It can be like when you met your significant other, when your kids were born, or like when Star Wars was released on theaters.
May 25th, 1977.
Good man, high five. This is a personalized gift, and you can choose from more than 15 designs, your special commemoration message, and the title. It is durable, and it's going to last for generations.
Yeah, but how do they know what the stars look like on that day?
Well, Under Lucky Stars has proprietary methods of locating stars that have been verified by NASA astrophysicists to ensure their accuracy. This also makes for a great surprise gift. Every time you look at this map, you'll be reminded of your special moment, like when you met your store manager. Under Lucky Stars also supports and fundraises for the International Dark Sky Association, which is dedicated to limiting light pollution and space litter so we can actually see all the stars in the sky. So, Under Lucky Stars is running a sale right now, plus they are offering ScreenCrush viewers an exclusive discount on any order with the code ScreenCrush. Go to UnderLuckyStars/ScreenCrush or click our link below to get your star map now. Now back to what I was saying. Now, we do see some similarities between Jean and Madeline Pryor. Madeline wanted Scott to leave the X-Men to raise their baby, just like Jean does here. And Madeline also felt like she had to compete with the X-Men and Scott's sense of duty to the team. But again, we're going to talk more about that a little later in the video. Right away, there are a few key differences in the opening of this episode. For starters, Cyclops is always the person who narrated the recap.
Previously on X-Men.
But now Magneto has taken over that role.
Previously
on X-Men.
It's subtle, but it shows how Magneto has taken Scott's place as leader of the team. And to highlight that difference, Magneto is now the first person in the intro as team leader. He is wearing his giant M suit from the comics, designed by the great John Romita Jr. And there was like a long period of time in the books when Chris Claremont, the X-Men writer, had Magneto reform and become the team leader. This all started when he reinvented the character in Uncanny X-Men number 150. Prior to this issue, Magneto had always been a very one-note, I will destroy you and rule the world type of villain. But that issue revealed that Magneto was actually a survivor of the Holocaust. And there's a moment where he almost kills Kitty Pryde, aka Shadowcat, before he realizes that she's just a young girl, a young Jewish girl, the very type of child that he was trying to protect. Magneto then just stops his attack on humanity and goes off to find himself. He allied with the X-Men during Secret Wars and eventually accepted Charles's offer to lead the school in his place. This is something that the original series hinted at for a long time, with Charles constantly asking Magneto to join him.
It was good to fight alongside you again, Charles.
Then join me in my work. Did it feel so odd, Magnus, working together?
No, Charles.
Now notice how in the intro, Magneto even takes these beams and creates an X to show that he's now a member of the team. The intro also fully removes Professor Xavier, so actually maybe he really is dead, and in his place they show recreations of previous episodes. We see Storm beating Callisto in combat to take over leadership of the Morlocks, the sewer-dwelling mutants the X-Men first encountered in Season 1, who we see later this episode. Now I think this is here to hint at one of the big events in this episode, Storm losing her powers, which is like a whole other massive story from the comics I want to talk about in a bit. And then we also see Jean as Dark Phoenix. Now, this was an epic 9-part story from Season 3 adapted from the comics. The TLDR here is that Jean was possessed by a cosmic force called the Phoenix Force that saved the universe. But the Phoenix eventually drives Jean insane and she turns evil, destroying entire suns. Jean sacrifices her own life to free the Phoenix, but then the X-Men reanimate her by giving up a portion of their own life forces.
The gift need not come from a single entity. A smaller portion from many is possible.
Now we also see Bishop in his time portal from Days of the Future Past. Now every time Bishop would travel into the past, it was to prevent a major disaster that caused the rise of the Sentinels, like an assassination or a plague, or the death of Charles Xavier in the 1950s from a time-traveling assassin. Now we're not exactly sure why he has traveled to the present day now. We only know that his time band isn't working. But this episode also featured another important time traveler in the X-Men canon that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. In the opening credits, we also see a shot of Magneto on Asteroid M, his orbital base that we saw in the Season 4 arc Sanctuary. Now, in those episodes, Magneto built an asteroid as a haven for mutants, but he was betrayed by a power-hungry acolyte named Fabian Cortez, and afterwards Magneto got really depressed.
Losing Asteroid M has made me weary.
The episode is titled Mutant Liberation Begins, a play on the speech that Magneto gave in the final episode, Graduation Day.
The liberation of mutant kind has begun.
We open at Coney Island, where a ride is malfunctioning and a kid's cassette Walkman is destroyed. All seems lost until Magneto shows up, embracing his new role as a hero. Now, I should note that this idea of Magneto becoming a good guy and leading the X-Men after Xavier's death was also in the groundbreaking crossover Age of Apocalypse. That story is about an alternate timeline where Xavier was assassinated before he formed the X-Men, and so his best friend Magneto swears to fulfill his dream in a world where Apocalypse has taken over the United States. This was a great crossover we're going to talk about a little bit later in the video. Now, another news report catches us up, telling us that
gone missing after failing to launch a mutant rebellion.
Which is from the series finale, Graduation Day, where Magneto chooses to save Xavier's life instead of leading a worldwide mutant liberation.
Why now, my greatest enemy, and perhaps my only friend. But I have waited all my life for this moment!
During this opening, we see the War Room from Dr. Strangelove, which was also replicated in the movie X-Men First Class. The newscaster is one Trish Tilby, who is one of Beast's love interests in the comics. And then we see this Friends of Humanity terrorist using a control collar to power the gun that will eventually rob Storm of her powers. So, in the comics, this character is called the Executioner. He was a former FBI agent named Carl Denty, who was the partner of Fred Duncan, the FBI agent who used to feed Charles Xavier information and was probably played by Oliver Platt in First Class, though they never name his character. After Duncan's death, Denty stole his X-Men gear and dedicated himself to punishing mutants for their crimes. Then we see the Friends of Humanity holding the Morlocks hostage, and notice how when Magneto approaches Leech, his energy field dissipates, because Leech's power is to cancel out the abilities of other mutants. Back at the mansion, Beast lays down some Mark Twain.
The only safe and sure way to destroy your enemy is to make him your friend.
I'm really glad they're keeping up with this Beast tradition, giving him a quote like every episode. The book book previously on X-Men even has an entire chapter devoted to B's best quotations. So the X-Men are trying to make sense of Magneto now leading the team, and Bishop says,
"Seen a lot of futures, but Magneto leading the X-Men. That's a new one."
So this is where I should mention that in the X-Men universe, the future is always changing. Bishop came back in time to prevent the rise of the Sentinels, but when he returned, it turned out that a plague was killing mutants instead. In the X-Men comics, Scott and Jean's daughter Rachel arrives from the future, but after Jean has died and never given birth to a daughter. Rachel also notices several differences from her own timeline and that universe that she currently inhabits. And I actually think that Rachel Summers might end up being in this show, but I'm going to talk about that a bit later. Then Rogue says,
"Maybe we should take a page from the Professor's playbook and give Eric a second shot."
So, a few things to unpack here. First of all, remember, Rogue was once a villain. Mystique actually ordered her to drain the power of Carol Danvers, which we saw back in Season 2. Now, maybe because Rogue was a member of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, this might explain why she and Magneto have connections to their villainous past that they hint at later on in the episode.
That was a long time ago, Eric. And that cat's gotta stay in its bag. You hear me?
This is also why she's quicker to forgive him than the other X-Men. Also, she calls him Eric, which shows her personal connection. But also, when the first season of the animated series debuted, Xavier only called Magneto Magnus.
"A dedicated young aide named Magnus assisted me."
This is because, at that time, they had not even revealed Magneto's name in the comics. That didn't happen until X-Men issue 300. Magneto has sent the Morlocks to Genosha. Now, when we first saw Genosha, it was a slave state that used mutants to build infrastructure for Master Mold. But in the episode Sanctuary, Magneto liberated the island, and on graduation day we saw that it had become a sanctuary for mutants, just like it eventually becomes in the comics. Jean refuses to scan Magneto's mind without permission, an ethical rule of the Professor's that she still follows. In her room we see the photo of her and Scott that Wolverine used to touch in the famous meme, and we also see her old Marvel Girl suit. Now, this is the first uniform that she wore after graduating from the classic X-Men Yellow, and the last time she wore this was when the X-Men battled the Shi'ar for her life when the Dark Phoenix was going out of control. Jean is worried about their child being a mutant, just like she was in the finale of Season 1.
"If we have children, they'll be mutants. They'll face the same problems we have all their lives."
Meanwhile, in Magneto's study, he is holding his old helmet, like he's looking at his old self. He originally built the helmet as a psi shield against Professor Xavier, but now, with Xavier gone, he doesn't need it, and it's just a reminder of his past life. But, you know, the helmet also placed an emotional barrier between himself and Xavier. It prevented his best friend from connecting with him, and it was a sign that he was no longer Eric, he was Magneto. Now he's questioning if he can actually change and literally become a new man. Also, this romantic tension here between Rogue and Magneto is not new.
"I feared you would do your best to avoid being alone with me, Rogue."
In the Age of Apocalypse comics, they're actually married in an alternate present because Magneto figured out how to use his powers to cancel out Rogue, so he's the only man that she can actually touch. And in this show, it's going to create a love triangle between them and Gambit.
"The blast had your name on it. Should be you leaving, mon ami."
Then the UN shows up to arrest Magneto, which happened in the classic X-Men issue 200, The Trial of Magneto. This episode lifts entire dialogue from that issue, and for my money, it actually is better written in places. Both stories feature a very public trial in front of a tribunal, and the trials are attacked by would-be assassins, and the X-Men then have to enforce the rule of law. Also, during these events, Madeline Pryor gave birth to Cyclops' son, just like Jean gives birth in this episode.
If that really is Jean.
If that's Jean, and it may not be, I'll explain what I mean a little bit later in the video. Now, the trial is being broadcast on WHIH, the MCU news network, where they release news and interviews on digital shorts, like this one leading up to Captain America Civil War. Wolverine says,
"Cooper's listing every nasty step Magneto's taken from here to Asteroid M."
Now, you may notice that Wolverine sounds a little different despite being voiced by the same actor. This is in part due to the actor getting older, but also because they wanted Wolverine to sound more like Charles Bronson, his original inspiration from the comics. Outside the UN, we see Friends of Humanity protesters. Now, Season 1 of the show ended with a pro-mutant president taking power.
"We must not forget that mutants are human beings."
Afterwards, a fringe group called the Friends of Humanity rose to power, similar to the Ku Klux Klan. And now we see that this fringe group is so large that they've become mainstream, as they become a mob and storm a government building to interrupt an official procedure, which I have to think was inspired by the insurrectionist riot at the Capitol in 2021. When the trial begins, the shot of Magneto being shackled is an homage to the classic John Romita Jr. cover of X-Men 200, except now he's also wearing a mutant control collar like we saw in the episodes Slave Island and in the Deadpool movies. And just like in the issue, Magneto outlines how his life story has influenced his decisions.
"My people's homes were burned to ash because we dared to call God by another name.
This entire monologue is actually Magneto questioning himself. Can he ever really change? I don't think he's sure of himself at this point, but he has seen that his way does not really work, and he can never forgive himself if he didn't at least try the path that his best friend has laid down for him.
Charles Xavier entrusted me with his dream.
So in the middle of all this heady character drama, we get the best laugh of the series.
He's here!
Apocalypse?
The baby!
Oh, crap.
I love this so much. The warrior response to birth was also my favorite joke in Star Trek The Next Generation.
Congratulations. You are fully dilated to 10 centimeters. You may now give birth.
So now, Wolverine has to drive Jean to the hospital, and he still has the same Jeep that he drove in the pilot episode of the show. On the way, we see a sign for Wine's Cafe and Diner, named after comic book writer Len Wein. Len Wein co-created Wolverine and the new X-Men, writing Giant Size X-Men #1. Plus, he wrote several episodes of the original animated series. We also see Romita's Salon, named after John Romita Jr., who had a legendary run on X-Men, drawing the issue The Trial of Magneto. One of the bystanders here is wearing a Happy Face shirt, which I guess you could say is a Watchmen Easter egg. And I loved how Jean, even though she's like in labor, is able to not only keep this guy safe, but also calmly make sure he doesn't spill his drink. Back at the UN, one of the protesters has a sign that reads, "Evolution is a lie," which of course is something a lot of people actually believe. But saying this is another way of saying that mutations and mutants are not natural because they're not part of the evolutionary process. This mirrors how the X-Men have always resonated with the gay community. Mutants hit puberty and suddenly realize that they are different from mainstream society and then are hated for being who they are. The X-Men movies really embrace this connection.
Have you tried not being a mutant?
So when the Executioner attacks, you can tell that he had studied the X-Men weaknesses. He knows to attack Cyclops and remove his visor, which is also how a powerless Storm won leadership of the X-Men from Cyclops in issue 201. Lady Deathstrike joins the battle. Now, she first appeared in Uncanny X-Men 205, but we did see her back in season 3 of the animated series. Funny story, one of the overseas animators actually drew her with like massive cleavage. So they had to increase their budget to get them to add in a white shirt under her vest so the children wouldn't be scared.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
Now, her real name is Yuriko, and she was once in love with Logan, but after he disappeared to get the Weapon X treatment, she got cybernetic implants of her own. Colossus also shows up. Now, in the comics, he was a key member of the team from issue 93 all the way until he left to join Magneto in issue 304, but he's only ever been a guest star on the animated series. I would actually love to see him added to the permanent roster. And also, one of my all-time favorite characters, Psylocke, shows up. Now, in the comics, she was an English rose named Betsy Braddock, sister of Captain Britain. But after entering a portal called the Siege Perilous, she swapped bodies with a Japanese assassin named Quanon and started using psychic knives. She also appeared in the final arc of Season 4 and was actually originally set to join the team permanently at the end of Season 4 before they added more episodes for Season 5. At the hospital, the doctor says,
"You people can lose control of your powers, and if she needs a C-section..."
Mirroring the unfortunate history of segregated hospitals in America where non-white people were not treated at the better, more expensive white hospitals. Back at the hearing, Magneto creates giant swords of metal, but he uses them to contain and protect people and not to attack. This is a really neat visual way of showing how now he will use his powers to protect mankind instead of using them to attack humanity. He also does this so Storm can create a shield of electricity, and combining his powers with an X-Man's is another way of showing how he is slowly integrating into Charles's dream. And then the moment. Storm takes the shot that was meant for Magneto and loses her powers. Now, this is an almost exact recreation of when this happens in the comics in issue 185. In that issue, a mutant called Forge, who actually leads X-Factor in the original animated series, was paid by Val Cooper to create a gun to neutralize mutant abilities. Now, they did this to capture Rogue, who was a newly reformed supervillain who had just broken into a S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier. But then, Gyrick, jerk, cranks the gun all the way up to 11 and Storm jumps in the way of the blast. So this kicks off an amazing arc for Storm in the comics, where she has to learn to not feel the wind. And she has to rediscover who she is and how she can now lead the team. She also falls in love with Forge, the man who inadvertently stole her powers. This emotional conflict was explored in 2 great issues called Life Death, which is the name of an episode of this series. So I think this is going to be like really gut-wrenching to see in this show.
The breeze is gone.
Magneto captures the Executioner, rotating him like a clock that is either counting down to mankind's extinction or to his own forgiveness and a new beginning. For him, Storm losing her powers is an attempt at making his own kind extinct. He already saw his people eradicated during the Holocaust.
This is your dream. My kind splayed before you, powerless and afraid.
And for a moment, you feel like Magneto is just gonna turn evil again.
Is this the High Road's destination?
He brings the judges and executioner up above the clouds to send this message. He is God. He even threatens to smite them.
So small I could smite you with a step.
And at this moment, he really wants to smite them. But instead, he gives us something to remember about the Earth.
How vast it is versus how small we make it.
And man, what a brilliant cutaway to Jean, who at that moment is making something small, a baby. This also reminds me of Christopher Reeve's final speech as Superman.
Because when you really look at it, it's just one world.
Similarly, Magneto has one simple question about the world.
And that my kind, like yours, have the right to live in it.
And the bitter double meaning of that last line.
Do not make me let you down.
And I love how those words like intone his hope for the future, but they also drip with a threat of what he would do if they caused him to become a villain again. Exquisite writing. And then we meet Scott and Jean's son and the other time traveler, Nathan.
The baby's a time traveler?
Well, he is in the comics. You see, in the comics, baby Nathan gets infected with a technovirus, which we also saw in this show. They can't cure him, so instead they sent him to live in the future where he grows up to become Cable. And believe it or not, they kind of hinted at this all the way back in season 1.
Name, Cyclops.
I know about him. And Jean Grey. Continue.
And then the UN pardons Magneto and agrees to admit the mutant nation Genosha into the United Nations. As Scott and Magneto watch the news, they drink dark roast coffee. This may be a tongue-in-cheek way for Scott to acknowledge and accept the darkness that Magneto adds into the team. Now, Scott and Jean are preparing to leave the team, just like how after Nathan was born, Scott and Madeline Pryor moved to Alaska. It didn't go well for either of them, that's all I'll say. So this new optimism is tempered by Storm's devastating news.
The effects appear permanent.
It's just heartbreaking. She looks at her uniform, which still bears the wound on her chest, symbolizing how the shot didn't just take away her powers, it took away her heart. Also, the pattern of the blast looks similar to the panel where she loses her powers in the comics. And then a thunderbolt strikes. And for the first time since her childhood, Storm is afraid of the weather. She writes a letter to Jean saying,
You of all the X-Men know the heartbreak of saying goodbye, having said it so many times.
Referring to how Jean had to take the Macron crystal into the sun to save the universe, and how she once sacrificed her own life to release the Phoenix from her mind. Under her narration, we see Morph try to tempt the Canuck Logan with Canadian beer to cheer him up after he saw Scott and Jean together. And then he turns into Sabretooth to egg him into a wrestling match. Now, last episode, I said Morph was being kind of a dick for teasing Logan about Jean.
And I'm having the most beautiful baby in the world with the most boring man in the world.
But now, I get it. Morph is the only guy who's not afraid of Wolverine, who can actually call him out on his shit. Now we see why Logan was so heartbreaking when he thought that Morph died.
I'll avenge you, my friend. I swear it.
Magneto looks at a photo of himself with Charles, which was probably taken during their friendship, which we saw flashbacks of in Enter Magneto. Rogue touches his skin, and notice how Gambit, overhearing in the hallway, drops the Queen of Hearts, a card associated with love, to show that he's heartbroken. And then the episode ends with a second Jean Grey showing up. So the question is this the clone Madeline Pryor? Now there are rumors that Sinister is going to be the antagonist of this season, and he was the villain who cloned Jean Grey and created Madeline Pryor in the comics. And also, there was a brief period of time at the end of season 2 when Sinister kidnapped Jean and held her hostage, and then the X-Men came to rescue her in the Savage Land. So it's possible that during that time, Sinister was able to clone Jean, and then maybe he sent the clone back to the X-Men. So the Jean that we know from seasons 3 through 5, the one who became the Phoenix, that could have just been a clone.
Say what?
Also in the comics, Madeline Pryor goes insane and becomes the villain, the Goblin Queen, during an event called Inferno. It's like an incredible crossover that could definitely be adapted into this show. Or it could be that there is no clone, and this is like the real Jean. In the comics, it turned out that Jean was never possessed by the Phoenix Force. Instead, the Phoenix created a facsimile of Jean and then created an energy cocoon for her body to regenerate at the bottom of the Hudson River. I'm very curious to see how this is all going to tie into Jean's vision. Like, who was that? Was that a vision of Nathan, of Rachel Summers, or was it a vision of herself from the future? Guys, let me know what you thought of the episode and all your thoughts and theories down in the comments or at me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe and smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy.